Funded initially by a Kickstarter campaign in 2015 and released a year later as an early access title, We Happy Few is a first-person action-adventure game from relatively young Montreal developer Compulsion Games. This dark, Orwellian vision of an alternate 1960s Britain takes place in the fictional town of Wellington Wells, where a mind-altering drug called joy has become mandatory and helps those under its influence to see the world through permanent, rose-tinted, unicorn-endorsed, rainbow-rimmed beer goggles in an attempt to wash out a shared traumatic stain on the town's wartime record. Those who stop taking joy, or have some sort of reaction which makes them unable to take it anymore, are referred to as downers, and are, if they're lucky, exiled to Wellington Wells' generously named Garden District, where they must survive on whatever they can find amongst the rubble of the ruined houses and burnt-out vehicles. It is as not one, but 3 of these downers you play in We Happy Few, as the game puts you in the shoes of these 3 very different characters, one after another, playing first as Arthur Hastings, then Sally Boyle, and finally Ollie Starkey, each with their own harrowing story, each trying to escape. It's an ingenious narrative device which allows players to see the same events from 3 very different and just occasionally overlapping viewpoints. Unfortunately, as I spent over 36 hours finding out, that is more or less where the genius of We Happy Few begins and ends. The country in between those points, a flat cardboard cutout, the title taken from Shakespeare's Henry V, presumably serving as code for the few dozen gamers around the planet who were happy with a procedurally generated wasteland of uninteresting locations populated by incredibly stupid NPC clones, muttering lines of well-known British literature in place of original dialogue, all suffering under the weight of game mechanics more awkward than the plot of Kingdom Hearts explained using food emojis.
Apparently, it's quite clever and complex.
The main problem, as I saw it with We Happy Few, was that it never really made up its mind what it wanted to be. And, as relatable as that might be to a YouTube gamer in his 40s, We Happy Few should serve as a cautionary tale about trying too hard to please all the people all the time. Starting its life in early development as a repeatable survival game and slowly morphing into something else entirely in response to feedback from early access players.
This is the best of all possible worlds. Nothing gets done, but everyone's happy.
It doesn't matter what you produce, someone is gonna hate it. From movies and video games to poetry, painting, sculpture, and those little flying saucer sweet thingies that were essentially just sherbet-filled styrofoam packing peanuts. I mean, seriously, what were those things?
I'm pretty sure they're edible.
The point is, you can't please everybody. One person's Empire Strikes Back is another person's Phantom Menace, and trying to please everyone inevitably results in the kind of muddy, confused, vaguely dark, vaguely comic, sort of survival, sort of action-adventure that We Happy Few turned out to be.
Isn't that the decision we all made?
Of course, even dirty great holes in the ground occasionally turn up bits of broken pottery and interesting-looking stones that you might use to prop doors open when it's hot. And though few and far between, there are occasional moments of laugh-out-loud humour.
Now make sure there isn't a short circuit. Fucking apprentices.
One of the things I liked about the inventory system is that the overload mechanic is gradual, something which a few games do but more should take on board. Rather than suddenly reaching a point where you can barely move at all, We Happy Few lets you know you're overloaded, limiting your movement to some extent, as with most games, but adds a second overload bar which slowly fills up until you simply cannot move another inch. There are plenty of mini Easter eggs for fans of British television and especially literature, ranging right through British history from Michael Caine references and Monty Python lines, to Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, all the way through to Yeats and Shakespeare and beyond. I was so sure that the plague wastrels in the game seemed to be muttering in Old English, and I do mean old, that I listened to and copied down phrases only to discover they were quoting lines from Beowulf. The developers have gone overboard with British stereotypes in some places, but one or two of those stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason.
Spot of tea?
As a nation, for example, we do, on the whole, tend to share a subconscious belief that a nice strong cup of tea makes almost all the world's woes that little easier to bear, at least in the short term.
Would you like some tea?
And the influences on the game's development are obvious and everywhere. The Prisoner, A Clockwork Orange, V for Vendetta, George Orwell's 1984, Terry Gilliam's Brazil, Doctor Who. In fact, it struck me very early on that the basic plot of this game is what you'd get if you overlapped Terry Gilliam's Brazil with this episode of Doctor Who from the Matt Smith era. And this early scene from the game gave me, and apparently many others, a very BioShock vibe. And obviously, none of that makes for a bad game in itself. The developers have in no way tried to hide their influences, and in fact, those were some of the things which I enjoyed most about the game. But as much as those sort of things can heighten enjoyment of an already enjoyable game, when all is said and done, a video game rises or falls on its gameplay mechanics. And in that department, I'm afraid We Happy Few handles about as naturally as an inner city high school with a wheel at each corner.
Oh shit!
The heads-up display is a cluttered mess. The inventory system is far from intuitive. The letters menu, for one, is upside down, so the newest items are all the way down at the bottom. And picking certain things up from a crate and leaving others is awkward, so you either take everything, or switch from the container to your inventory system and then cycle through to the tab related to the item you want, select it, and only then can you pick those items up one at a time. After completing quests, at least when I played the game, the quest markers seem to disappear off your map as and when it suits them, which can lead to confusion when trying to head towards markers. Try as I might, I never managed to figure out what exactly it was that made old quest markers disappear. Some of them seemed to disappear after 10 minutes, some of them were still there the next time I logged in, and then weren't there at all 15 minutes later. Combat is an unsatisfying button-mashing mess, which varies almost not at all regardless of the weapon being used. Furthermore, the points at which you receive certain tools and equipment are far too poorly spaced. If you're doing a straightforward story playthrough, for example, you will probably never find the multi-tool it keeps telling you is needed for disarming traps, unless you're playing as Ollie, who carries this item from the beginning of his story. Not that it matters much, because traps in this game are about as damaging as a food fight at a dust mite's wedding, so it's not really worth your time trying to disarm them.
Ha! Now you can't move until I take my hand off this button. Oh, shit.
There is a lock-picking mechanic in this game, though I use the term mechanic very loosely since it's just as simple as holding a single button while the game does the work, so I was left wondering what it was really there for at all. One interesting part of the game is that you must wear different clothes in order to blend into the various different areas of the game. A nice clean suit is what's needed in the inner city district such as Maidenholm, but wear those same pristine clothes out in the Garden District and wastrels will instantly spot you as an outsider and attack you on sight.
You a tourist? You dress like one.
Presumably becoming enraged with jealousy and resentment at the sight of some posh knob who hasn't yet had to rip up their Calvin Klein undercrackers to make a padded glove for fighting off killer bees. All very interesting stuff, but there is no third-person option, and no way at all to see what you look like to others as you flip repeatedly between the different districts, other than to hope that you remember to delve through the menus each time to change your outfit before strolling round the parade, imagining that you're blending right in with the respectable citizens until an 80-year-old granny produces a flaming lead pipe and tries to insert it in you because it turns out you're wearing a rubber catsuit you got from the fetish club.
Nudge, nudge, smirk, smirk. Say no more, say no more.
So what do you do now? Run, obviously, but where to? Those dense bushes there? No. What about those trees? No. Okay, how about that flower bed? Yes, that's the one. That small patch of waist-high yellow flowers will make it appear as though you have vanished off the face of the earth entirely. Oh, and also that tiny potted plant. Enemy AI in We Happy Few is questionable to say the least. The entire town can be chasing you through the streets intent on murdering you, but hide in a bin for 30 seconds, and all those same people have not only forgotten what you did, but apparently who you are. The casual greetings of "nice day for it" once again emanating from their chipper little faces. Their hideous murdering implements now tucked away somewhere, and where did they come from in the first place? I mean, fair enough when out amongst the wastrels in the Garden District, but the towns are supposed to be Middle England utopias, where everyone walks around in a fog of peaceful oblivion, swinging their arms and whistling because they're all off their faces on happy juice. The worst crimes imaginable in Wellington Wells are littering and spitting in the streets, so where the fuck
Watch your mouth, laddie. What would your mum think?
did that 4-foot-tall old lady suddenly get that chainsaw clumsily attached to a baseball bat with rusty nails that are on fire? These law-abiding florists and greengrocers are all tooled up like post-apocalyptic psycho gangsters, and yet my character runs in the street and all of a sudden I'm public enemy number one.
You don't think I'm the one who decides these things, do you?
These sorts of immersion-breaking wonders litter this entire game. Most are simply a mild annoyance. I found the sound design to be quite poor, for example, although some of the actual music is quite good. And the constant dialogue that the player character spouts, which only really makes sense with Ollie Starkey, is repeated over and over. Not the worst thing in the world when NPCs do this, but when the character you're playing as fills every quiet moment with the same 5 outspoken musings, it begins to grate a little. There were lots of occasions where the game made it very clear to me that I had to pull a certain lever or push a particular button. But these hints were often given without context, so I often had no idea why I had just pushed that button, or, quite often, what that button had just done. Did it open something? Close something? Set something on fire? I didn't know. Just that something somewhere had happened and the game would now give me another task.
I feel so chivalrous turning off that dangerous steam, if that is indeed what I did.
This kind of disconnection with the world around you makes you feel less a protagonist in the complex story of the game world and more like a rat in a maze pushing buttons for bits of cheese. And even that might not be so bad were it not such a poorly designed maze. Compulsion games have a fairly small team, so not everything can be designed by humans. This is understandable, and many of the bits that are really do look gorgeous. But that just makes the rest of the game look that much more drab and uninteresting. Procedural generation is a necessary part of increasingly large game worlds, and we've seen it work well in some games, but I'm afraid We Happy Few is not one of them. Every single part of the drab grey garden district looks exactly the same as every other part, and every street of the inner city looks exactly like every other. Street after identical street where you can't interact with anything at all would be bad enough if you only had to pass through there once. But many of the quests don't vary much more than the level design, and so many of them involve hiking back and forth between the same dull areas. And in many of those areas you can't run, because that alerts the citizens to your downer status, so you will be spending a great deal of time walking very slowly through large areas, little more interesting than the inside of a value cereal packet.
They're painting the streets in fucking rainbows. Have you not noticed?
Poor balance is one of We Happy Few's biggest problems though, and it can be seen in so many aspects of the game. The first character you play as is Arthur Hastings, and you'd be forgiven for thinking he was the main protagonist, since his story lasts about as long as those of the other 2 characters combined. And although I played this game on the normal difficulty setting, the game seems almost laughably easy through his entire part of the story.
It's not my fault. I'm being controlled by someone I've never even met.
Then we come to Sally Boyle, whose story, for reasons I can't reveal for fear of spoilers, is almost impossibly difficult for the first couple of hours, certainly in comparison to Arthur's. Now, my initial reaction was, okay, I see what they're trying to do here. They're trying to make a point about how much more difficult it was to survive as a woman, especially in the 1960s. Fair enough, good point, well made. But very quickly, I realised that Sally can't seem to wield any weapon much bigger than a letter opener because it's too heavy. She continually comments on how useless she is at making things, and apart from her superb skills in chemistry, she seems to get by almost entirely on her looks, apparently having seduced half the men in Wellington Wells to get the things she needs.
Do you really think I'm that awful?
So much for progressive thinking.
There you are.
I did have a bit of a smile to myself as the stories of our three protagonists were tied up at the end of the game, though I think that might have been because I was as keen to escape the place as they were, and the credits closed out to an interesting and wholly original 1960s style tune. Overall, though, We Happy Few promised much but delivered very little. A potentially brilliant story, poorly told through the eyes of unpleasant characters, living in a drab, repetitive, and often infuriating world.
I'd forgotten just how heinous a person I am.
This Bioshock-esque scene with its colourful, vibrant and inventive design but unsettling dystopian undertones alone influenced me to buy the game 3 years after I first saw this trailer. With the benefit of hindsight though, that's money I would rather have spent on 20 fairly uninteresting supermarket brand frozen pizzas. The kind that fill a hole but don't really satisfy and occasionally have chunks of stuff that might be meat but could just as easily be little bits of cardboard packaging that found their way into the topping. If Compulsion Games can put together a development team with as much passion for game mechanics and level design as they clearly have for storytelling, I'm sure they have a beloved classic in their future. But this one is very much like those pizzas. Appealing in the photo, but ultimately about as tasty as the box it's printed on. Those have been my opinions of this game, but if you want to make up your own mind about it, We Happy Few is available on PC, Xbox One or PS4, and is currently available at no extra cost to anyone with Xbox Game Pass. The first DLC for the game, entitled They Came From Below, was released on April 4th, and stars two of the main game's more interesting characters, James and Roger, assistants to the underused Dr. Faraday. It is entirely possible this DLC, along with others coming later in the year, will be one of the many vital missing pieces in the We Happy Few picture, but I'm afraid that will be for someone else to say, since this game has had as much of my time and money as it's going to get.
I'm gonna have the worst headache for the rest of the week.
You can follow me on Twitter at knights_arcade if you want to join in with conversations I'm often having with other YouTube gamers and occasionally developers. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell if you want to see more from myself and my occasional collaborators. But until next time, from Knights Arcade, this is Sleepless Night, saying nighty-night.
Well, wasn't that fun? I think we made all the necessary observations. I'll unlock the chair.